as we begin, I want to, in this first class, try to get a bit of perspective, sort of the bird's eye view of the topic that we're going to delve into. And one of the most important things for me in thinking about a historical, cultural phenomenon like sacred music is to have a timeline within your grasp, so that you can see not only the development of music, but also the role that other events in history have sort of taken in the development of really probably the most prominent of the sacred arts. Before we do that, though, I'd like to just talk in general terms about the study of liturgy and what goes into that. So we can have a little bit of a brainstorming session here. What disciplines would you say? By the way, I very much like the seminar model for class over the lecture model, but let's begin by just doing a little brainstorming session here. What disciplines come into play when we're talking about liturgy? Anybody have, obviously, I'll do the first one. Music. That's the easy one. That's why we're all here. So what other important discipline? What's that? Text, and language. All right, another? Fine arts, sure. I'm going to put in architecture as in my opinion, the second most important art in relation to liturgy. What else? What's that? Gestures, yeah. A discipline that you might try to use to describe gesture would probably fall under gesture is very difficult to categorize, but we'll put it down for now as its own category. Yeah, it is. It's kind of balletics, something like that, perhaps, right? Deportment, yeah. It's another good word for it. When I first started grade school, deportment was on the report card, but after about 2 years it disappeared. I don't know what happened, but it was gone. Another important. What about the reason for liturgy? With the overriding. Yeah, how about theology? Theology, an important discipline. And what's what they used to call the handmaiden of theology? What's the discipline that's sort of what was that? Philosophy. Just underneath theology, philosophy still does come into play here. Subset of philosophy, at least according to Aristotle. Wrote a book on it, De Anima. Psychology, yeah. Something else? I don't have a fixed list here. I mean, there's just sort of brainstorming, see what else might come into play. Yeah, visual arts. We'll put that up here with architecture. I think communitas would fall under the theology of the church, and probably would be a subset of that group. Yeah, anthropology, and I'll put down history as a corollary to that.
Would rhetoric be subsumed under language?
I think that's a better word for language, actually.
I see it divided between rhetoric and, say, poetry.
Yeah.
Like prose and poetry.
Yeah, rhetoric. I'll put poetry under here. Anthropology. My spelling is terrible, by the way, on the blackboard. I usually leave letters out, just so you know. And a whiteboard, too, for that matter. Any other broad ideas?
We haven't specifically mentioned apostolic power, although theology draws on it.
I think that would be, that the theology is such a massive item on this list that we would probably have so many sub estuaries that we could go on for quite a while with that. But let's keep the apostolic deposit, which is the idea of, how about traditio? We'll put an N on it, just do it in English. Tradition, which has a lot to do with that. A lot of these things are sort of interrelated too, and there's an overlaying of many of these ideas. But the one thing that I want to try to, we've gotten quite a good list. Is there anybody else who's dying to put something else up here? Okay, well, we'll leave this for the moment. You've got so many different genres of human endeavor listed up here that I would say that the study of the liturgy in many ways parallels the study of what really is the basis of our Western educational system, of the liberal arts. The liberal arts very much become physically expressed in the liturgy in a way that the university makes it a theoretical expression, but the actual hands-on, tactile experience of this is very much a connection to the 7 liberal arts. Does anybody happen to know? I'll try this again. Liberal arts. Okay, we've got the 3 little ones and then the 4 big ones. This would be the trivium, and then this would be the quadrivium. Of course, tri being the 3 and then quad being 4. What are the trivial arts? Grammar? Logic and rhetoric. Then the big ones are? Arithmetic. Yes. Geometry. Uh-huh.
Music.
Yeah.
And astronomy.
Right. Now, our understandings, having gone to school to some extent, of these ideas are not the same as, I'm just saying generally, if you're lucky to have had a real liberal arts education, which is sort of an editorial thing for me to say, then that's great. But for the most part, this is not exactly our experience in the general educational systems that we have access to. However, traces of it still remain. Music, for example, in the quadrivium, in the sense that you have the theoria, the theory of music, it's much more, in the Middle Ages, a mathematic endeavor, talking about proportions and ratios to a great extent. There's a treatise, De Musica, by Augustine, for example, which is about poetry and about proportion and but none of that would be very interesting to the lover of music for the most part. It's a little bit dry and it's a little bit on the numerological order. And the same thing is true with the other members of the quadrivium. And then the trivium tended to be much more verbal, much more language-based. However, nevertheless, all of these things, the trivium, the quadrivium, led to the study of what? After that, after you mastered these, you could move on to philosophy, right? And that was to be, the next step would be to go to theology. So this was all pointing in that direction. But in some sense, I always like to think of the study of liturgy in a way as being one means, one route into the entire Western experience. Not just, I mean, when I say Western, as far east as the Malabar coast in India, perhaps. it's a way for us to get into these different disciplines. And now we're just going to focus on this, in this particular arena, on the music. But a necessary diversion into language will be necessary. To a certain extent, the architecture will become important when we start talking about, for example, the music of the Gothic age, when polyphony, that means when you have more than one vocal line, when that comes into play, architecture is part of the inspiration behind that movement. Gesture and balletics and deportment are something that is extremely difficult to talk about in some ways, because there are so many missing pieces in our historical picture of the way that gesture was used in the liturgy. However, there are many things about it that we can, when we look in other liturgies besides the Roman Rite, for example, that we can ascertain some patterns and some general attitudes in regard to gesture and balletics. Theology is going to be extremely important for the study of any of these things, because it's the raison d'etre, the reason for the whole enterprise in the first place. What about psychology? This is an interesting thing, because it's sort of like theology and philosophy, sort of spans the gamut there. Why psychology in relation to architecture, for example? What notions come to mind?
I'd like to differentiate between the popular notion we have today of psychology versus you referenced de anima.
Yeah.
I mean, we talk about psychology, the study of the soul, as opposed to the study of behavior.
Right, yeah.
So which...
Well, I think that...
Today is what you want to say.
I think that in a certain sense, the modern notion of it is important as we look back in time. However, the study of the soul in the Middle Ages, and as it was filtered down into the scholastic period eventually, certainly Aristotle would not have been very important in the earliest ages of the development of the liturgy at all, because he was sort of a later influence. But when I say psychology in this particular context, I think that the modern notion of psychology is more what I'm getting at. For example, the idea in architecture of the Gothic architecture, for example, just as one element, or the Romanesque for that matter, the way that we experience space certainly is something that when we take when we look at it from our psychological point of view, walking into that firmament that this culture created is going to be different than perhaps it was in the Middle Ages. However, the idea that psychologically the space and the sound are going to intersect to make a different experience, perhaps.
Are you making a plea for phenomenology then?
Sort of, in a way. In a sense, it is a kind of phenomenal. In a sense, the psychology is trying to understand one's own experiences, perhaps. So it is sort of a fusion of that behavioral psychology with perhaps the more traditional sense of trying to understand de anima, the soul. In that sense, the person. Anthropologically, it's very interesting to look when we start to take a look at the different rites that, when I say R-I-T-E-S, rites, the way these things work. For example, if you think of a place like Metz, where Charlemagne would have had his sort of headquarters in Francia, or what we call Gaul, you would not necessarily expect the kind of influences from the East, from almost sort of doing an end run around the Roman Rite. But there are many elements that came from Eastern liturgies into the Gallican, or the Gaulish, that is French liturgy, that seems to be doing an end run around the Roman Rite. Because you would think that since the Roman Rite stands in between France and the Eastern liturgies, that there wouldn't necessarily be an easy path for those things. So the anthropology definitely comes into play in that sense. And then tradition is perhaps, in some ways, the most elusive, but also the most important notion to keep in mind because, just to give you an example, when you take a book like this one, this is the Roman Missal that I picked up from our library over here. If you look inside of it, you've got black text and red text. The red text is called, the red text are the rubrics. It's a word we use in common parlance, but rubrics here comes from the Latin word for red, rubra. And this is not a very good page for that, but I'll try to find a better one. Here we go. You take a look. This is a very good, look at all the red on that page. These rubrics detail the gesture, the boetics, the deportment of the ministers in this rite. Now, this is a particularly, this has to do with anthropology also. This is a particularly Roman idea that you can put these little red legalistic scribblings to tell you how to hold your hands or to how to move your body. This is a very Roman idea. In the East, rubrics in some places are non-existent and have never existed in certain rites. And in the rites where they do have rubrics, it's very recent because the idea of custom was so powerful that rubrics somehow seemed, in some ways, in the Eastern liturgies, sort of unseemly or unnecessary even. It's the way we've always done it has been, that was the rubric. Well, we always did it this way. So you can see that tradition in some ways is elusive, and the study of the gesture is also somewhat elusive. Even if you, yes?
I want to back up to psychology for a second. Maybe what we were thinking of the idea of narrative or drama in mythology.
Yeah, and in this sense, the idea of
Language or rhetoric per se,
and use of that kind of term like drama touches on what he was saying about a phenomenological interpretation, like von Balthasar speaks of the drama of the liturgy, and certainly that would have been much more in the phenomenological vein. However, let's sort of move from this discussion. So we're basically sort of set the scope, which is vast, enormous, in fact, and try to look a little bit more specifically, starting with this. This is the timeline that I labored over several different volumes to try to ascertain what, in fact, is the most important stuff in the last 3,000 years regarding sacred music and the development of our worship. And we're going to do a quick perusal of this timeline. In many ways, this will be a foreshadowing of future discussions that we're going to have. In fact, I'm going to give you the rest of these, and I'll just keep one. How about that? This will give you a little bit of a foreshadowing of future discussions that we're going to have, but it'll also give you kind of a general two-page summary, and I had to leave a lot out in doing this. But if we just take a look at the first page there where it says Sacred Music in the Catholic Church, a timeline. One of the things I've sort of decided to slightly amend the course sequence here and to slightly amend some of the titles for some of the lectures because I realized that I decided that I wanted to emphasize certain features a little bit more than others. For example, the first section here you've got the 10th to the 11th to the 10th century BC. That's a lot, 1,000 years basically between there and Christian worship. I want to take a little bit of time next week, for example, and take a look at some of the Jewish roots of our cultic experience. In many ways, our religion, the Catholic Christian religion, is a fusion of different cultural values. Our cultus, our rendering to God what is God's, is very much in the Jewish, extracted from our Jewish heritage. Our theology is more or less Greek, comes from, it's sort of rooted in the philosophy of the Greeks. And so we have some different dynamics culturally and historically that are coming into play. But I really think that the Jewish component is frequently, I don't want to say excluded, but I think something needs to be done to point up the importance of that relationship, particularly in the way that we pray and the way that Catholics worship. So that's something that we're going to focus on. But just take a look at some of these things. You've got David, the most important musical figure in probably the entire Bible. He was a king, a psalmist, a musician. He was a dancer of sorts. I imagine he danced before the Ark of the Covenant. And that sort of speaks a little bit to the gesture and the balletic and the deportment aspect. Do we have any idea at all what that dance looked like? We do not know, of course, what that would be. Judaism over time is a very interesting study because the values have shifted depending on the rabbinical interpretations. Here's an example. At the Passover, the Hallel is chanted, which is a group of psalms beginning with Psalm 112 and going through Psalm 118. Psalm 118 is the one that is extremely long, and it has all those Hebrew letters at the beginning, like Aleph and Beth and Gimel. And what has happened over time in the Passover is that rabbis have said, well, you only go up to the point where the woman gives birth to the child in the Psalms. Or then you go up to the point where Israel is delivered from Egypt. And then you go up to the point, well, no, you do the whole 118th Psalm. You do only half of it. So over time, the practice, even in Judaism, has fluctuated. And we have a fairly good idea, for example, of what was chanted at the time at which Christ instituted the Eucharist from the Passover. So there's some real details that we can get into there. Another important thing is that we have a notion of early Christian worship as sort of this free-form love feast, which in certain sense, agape, which is a word for a love feast, basically, that's what agape means, was a part of the early Christian experience. However, we have to remember that the worship of the Jews was extraordinarily developed. You had a full orchestra in the temple of at least 24 players. You had at least 24 professional male singers employed in the temple. Take that idea, 24 people in an orchestra, a big chorus like that, take that idea and compare it to Venice, circa 1610, Monteverdi. He has a full orchestra of string players. He has a full set of continuo instruments like the lute or the theorbo, which is a gigantic lute, which is sort of like a guitar-like instrument. Certainly has the organ. He has tons of singers, and he has them placed all over the Cathedral of St. Mark. So when we look at the worship of the temple, of which we have some details because of the scripture, but also because of the rabbinical record and the Mishnah, something that is also part of the history of Jewish worship, we could see certain parallels and certain resonances between the ancient worship of the Jews and our understanding of our own Christian worship through the centuries. So I think it's very important for us to take a closer look at some of there was a great book that came out by, it's called The Gifts of the Jews. I can't remember. Thomas Cahill. He's How the Irish Saved Civilization was another book that he wrote. But it's a remarkable sort of distillation of the contribution that the Jewish people have made to culture in general, and particularly to Western culture. So as we move on into the 1st and 2nd century, we get to the point where at the early church, when we think of the early church, we have to sort of imagine that there was a fire, and we lost the baby pictures to a certain extent. There's a very patchy information about what Christian worship was like in those days. However, we do know that there was some sense of rite, R-I-T-E, rite, ritual, because of the fact that the Eucharist is an outgrowth of something that was already a ritual, the Passover. So we would assume that much of that cultic, the sense of cult, perdured as the Passover, the Christian Passover, became the Mass over time. As we move down, we start to see the influence on the left-hand side of the various Roman events. You have an age of persecution. It's interesting that we have many, St. Justin Martyr, for example, tells us about the worship at Rome in the 2nd century. And it was certainly the beginnings of the age of persecution towards the end of that century. And all the way up to the time when Constantine legalizes the Christian religion by 313 at the Edict of Milan. There's a great deal that starts to become apparent as we move into the 4th, 5th century. We have the Leonine Sacramentary, Pope Leo the Great. This book is something that is a little bit of a strange book because it only has certain what we call proper texts. In other words, it has the texts of the 6th Sunday of Easter, and it has Pentecost, but there really isn't much else other detail. There are a few other masses too in there. And then we move down and we start to see the rise in the 6th century of the Benedictine influence, the monastic influence. Next to the Mass, the main object of Christian worship, we have a whole other system of worship called the Divine Office. It's now called the Liturgy of the Hours. And this is kind of almost like a parallel life to the Mass in worship. It's based on psalmody for the most part. The Book of Psalms are the basis of it. And in the new Liturgy of the Hours, since the liturgy was reformed in the 60s and 70s, we have the interpolation of other scriptural things, canticles from the New Testament, for example, the epistles of Paul and Peter. But basically, it's a scripture service. Mostly Psalms, but Scripture is involved in a general way there. If you flip over and we get into the end of the first millennium, into the second, another big event is going to be what's called the Carolingian Renaissance. It was a period of cultural flourishing that was sort of centered in among the Franks. Charlemagne, king of the Franks. Clovis was the first Christian French or Gallic monarch. Charlemagne certainly was a descendant of his. At least in authority, he was a descendant. Charlemagne adopted the Roman rite for Gallia, for the area of France. This was a big thing for him to have done because it meant that all of northwestern Europe, extending out from France all the way up to Britain and Ireland, and then certainly modern Flanders and the Netherlands and Holland, would have moved in the direction of Roman liturgical rule. It's kind of a reassertion of the original Roman influence across the Alps into Gaul. When you have the fall of Rome, which was more like a stumble actually, it wasn't such a fall as we probably think it was. Certainly the influence of Rome and the empire was reduced in northwestern Europe. This is a new age of Roman influence, and what it meant was that there was a supplanting of the native Gallic liturgy, which is called the Gallican Rite. The Gallican Rite pretty much was obliterated by this decision of Charlemagne to bring the Roman rite into his realm. It's a fairly serious decision, and when we look at the rite, we'll see that in some ways the Gallican rite sort of did a retroflex and influenced the Roman rite. So there was this kind of a wedding there. As you move down, you see in the second millennium, starting with the 10th century, well, the 11th and 10th century there, we have certain, the dominance of the religious orders starts to make an impression. First, you have this sort of flourishing of different monastic style orders, like the Cistercians. St. Bernard of Clairvaux probably being the most prominent of Cistercians. Heavily influential in Europe, all throughout Europe. He was a counselor to popes. And then you have the Carthusians, certainly, which were really founded slightly before where I have them listed. The Carthusians had their own liturgy. Sort of an interesting thing about the Carthusians, they eventually founded an order of sisters, nuns, not sisters, but nuns. And these Carthusian nuns, when they made their final vows, were invested with a ring, like a bishop wears, a stole, like a priest wears, and a crown. This, by the way, lasted up until very recently. And they would wear this regalia only 2 other times in their lives after their perpetual solemn vows were made. They would wear this regalia on their jubilee, and then for all eternity in their coffin. But one of the other interesting features is that liturgically, if there was no priest available, the ranking nun would put on a stole and sing the gospel at the office for the day. So there was this richness and different details of the church life that we've sort of forgotten in many ways, but are still part of the history that we should really try to get in touch with. I mean, a lot of times you say, well, you know, you look at the Catholic Church and its regard for women, and they say, oh, the critics would say, you know, look at how oppressive it all is. Women have never had, from a historical point of view, a better time of it anywhere on the planet than in Christendom. And the dignity that is shown to women in Christendom is really, I think, from a historical point of view, singular. And a lot of this can be seen through the liturgical life of the church. As we move down, we have another sort of revolution in the religious life with the mendicant friars. Mendicant friars, the idea of mendicant is to be a beggar, basically. That's the whole idea of being a mendicant. And you have the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and since we're in Our Lady of Lourdes Parish, I have to mention the Mercedarians. Very important order. At least to my livelihood, they're a very important order. And when these later friars would develop, these are really the end of the religious orders. Technically speaking, newer orders like the Jesuits are not technically orders per se, or the Vincentians. They're societies, as a better way of looking at them. But these orders, in many ways, developed their own liturgies. The Dominicans have their own rite, which is, rite is a strong word. We would call it a Dominican use of the Roman rite. And it's a very beautiful liturgy. It's still practiced. It was never suppressed after the council. I've seen it on a couple of occasions, and it's really remarkable. The Franciscans don't have their own rite, but something as beautiful as the Exultet, which is sung at the Easter Vigil. Exultet iam angelica turba celorum. It's a beautiful chant. That is Franciscan in origin. So we have the religious orders influencing the liturgy in very specific and very particular ways, either through special contributions like the Exultet or their own rites. Benedictines also have their own rite. The Carmelites have their own sort of use of the rite. Then we get, after the rise of the religious orders, we have sort of a kind of full flowering. You have to look at these religious orders as kind of the imagination of the church. This is new ways to be holy, new ways to express virtue, new ways to the funny thing is when you look at let's say television these days, I don't know how many, it seems like every television show involves the finding of a dead body and then find out what happened to this body, and there's so many shows like that. And the various permutations of evil seem to be the subject matter of a lot of our entertainment. You have to look at the Middle Ages as almost the opposite of that. It's looking at the various permutations of goodness and virtue that these religious orders, and then all of the wonderful things that came out of them, not just in terms of rite and music, but the flowering of goodness is really what, to me, the Middle Ages represents. And imagination, Christian imagination. The plague, of course, I look at the plague as sort of a parallel to the age of persecution. It was there, but it didn't really stop things. Things continued to develop. In fact, the plague really, from the point of view of music, many of the most imaginative developments in the history of music arose at the same time as the plague. The Renaissance itself was, in many ways, concomitant temporally with the plague. It sort of happened almost at the same time. 1350 used to be the old date that they would give for the very beginnings of the Renaissance, which I think is funny that say, well, 1350, something happened, somebody woke up and said, we're in the Renaissance. But it certainly could not have been like that. And the Renaissance spread very slowly, starting, from, most people would agree, in Italy and moving northward. Just a little object lesson, if you don't mind, in that spread of the Renaissance. Can anybody name a great Renaissance composer? Great 16th century, let's say. Palestrina, sure, he's sort of the archetype. That beautiful style didn't reach England until to the very beginnings of the 17th century with somebody like William Byrd, who was writing in this Renaissance style, while the rest of Europe had already gotten interested in what we'll call the seconda pratica, the second practice, which is the Baroque. So the Baroque was already born in, let's say, Venice, by the time William Byrd was writing sort of the epitaph of the Renaissance musical style. So it's interesting. Music is always about, 50 years behind the rest of artistic cutting edge. Music takes a little bit longer. I think it's because we have to wait for the words to be written, perhaps. Maybe that's one theory I have. Certainly the 16th century represents a very important period because of the Protestant revolt and then the consequent, the Counter-Reformation and the Council of Trent. This also marks the beginning of what is called the Tridentine era. And the Tridentine is the Latin form of Trent, the town in northern Italy where that council was held. So when you say the word Tridentine, you mean of or pertaining to the Council of Trent. There's much talk these days about the Tridentine Mass, which is sort of a misnomer because the Tridentine Mass is merely a point in time when the Mass was frozen. And in other words, there were no developments that were to be made after that point in time until the modern era, 1970, the new missile, 1969, November of 1969, the new missile came out. So essentially the Tridentine age is this age of sort of frozen liturgical development. There were changes between the Council of Trent and, the last missile. This one, in fact, right here, this is 1962. So there were continual developments, but big changes, there were none after that. And then as we look, I kind of put a little bit of a I like the first side much better than the second side, if you want to know my opinion. But if we look from after that, after the 17th century, I mentioned Descartes redirects philosophical inquiry, inaugurating the modern period. Now, Descartes, the Jesuits said, well, what did Descartes do? He was a Jesuit student, by the way. He crossed the Pons Asinorum, which is Latin for the bridge of asses. We'll just say that for lack of another. What did that mean? He said, what is knowledge? Do I really know anything? And he wasn't the first person to ask that question. He was certainly the first person to not get over that question. and so what ends up happening is that you have a total redirection of philosophy to the point where we start to doubt our own knowledge. And so philosophy from that point to this point was I think, greatly influenced by this crossing of the Pons Asinorum, as the Jesuits at Louvain used to say. Because they say, oh, you don't want to, René, don't cross that bridge. I mean, the idea had been around, but he crossed it, and he got a lot of good press, I guess, too, because it's had a great influence. In the 18th century, we have, by the way, also with Descartes redirecting philosophical inquiry, this, by the way, I think has a lot to do with our questions about psychology. Psychology and philosophy have a kind of a collision from the 17th century on. Now, musically, we have a similar kind of collision. At this same point in history, text and my using music to express text becomes very important. So if I'm talking about something that is, if I'm singing about, I don't know, the heights of the mountains, well, I should be singing at a high pitch so that I can express the heights of the mountains. And if I'm singing about de profundis, the deep depths, I should be singing low so that I can express that. This idea was really pretty new by the time the 18th century came around. And this is the birth of the Baroque. Now, Baroque means misshapen, actually, like a misshapen pearl, a big lump on one end. You lose any sense of equality between text and music. The text is really what's important from that 17th century onward. And then on the 18th century, you have the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. But you also have the concert mass, Bach, Haydn, Mozart. This is sort of an interesting, sort of anthropologically interesting. We take the text of the Mass, which is a prayer, and we isolate it and extract it from the ritual, and we make a concert out of it. It's sort of a strange thing. I don't think in Constantinople anything like that would have ever been done. It's a very interesting Western phenomenon to extract this prayer and then sort of make a picture out of it as opposed to using it. I'm a big fan of the masses of Bach, Mozart, and Haydn, believe me. But it's an interesting development that we can probably discuss. Yes?
You mean that they didn't write them to use that Mass in the first place, and then?
Many of them, no. The B minor Mass was not written, for example, to be performed at Mass. Many of the Masses of Haydn were, some of them weren't. For example, the Coronation Mass of Mozart the C minor Mass of Mozart was not meant to be written, was a concert Mass. The C major Mass of Beethoven was premiered at a concert. It was premiered at the same concert that the famous Fifth Symphony of Beethoven, same exact concert. This Mass had its premiere. So it was an interesting cultural expression. And maybe we can sort of discuss what that means as we get closer to talking about that period. In the 19th century, very interesting period. If you listen to the music of Franz Liszt, da-da-dee-da-dee-da-dee-dum. Anybody know what that melody is? Da-da-dee-dee. The Dies Irae. Those are the first couple notes of the Dies Irae. That piece, those four notes just pop up everywhere. in particularly the first half of the 19th century. The Symphonie Fantastique of Berlioz quotes the Dies Irae. Tons of piano pieces by Liszt and, can't think of his name. But anyway, there's a certain romanticism that has crept up about the past, and different chord changes that, different chords that make up music are being used to evoke another era. It's sort of an interesting phenomenon also. How can we use modern music to evoke the past? It was a very interesting idea, but they were trying to do this. There was a romanticism about the past that I think is typical of that era. It was called the Romantic era, first of all, but not just about moonbeams and polka dots. It's also about the Gothic age, the Gothic novel. You have there was a collection of poetry that called the Ossian's poetry. Ossian was supposed to be this fabled Irish poet from antiquity. It was made up in the 19th century, and they palmed it off as being, it was a fraud, in other words. Well, Schubert wrote songs to text by Ossian. Everybody wrote this music, say, oh, this is great, we have all this old poetry. Another one would be Clemens Brentano. Does anybody know the name Clemens Brentano? Yes. Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich, I guess she is now, right? He was her amanuensis, transcribing those visions. But he was also the author of a collection of poetry called Des Knaben Wunderhorn, or the Youth's Magic Horn. And he got together with this guy named Armin, A-R-M-I-N. And they kind of said, let's make some old-fashioned poems and say that we discovered this book of old poetry. Once again, another fraud, but it inspired countless musicians with the notion of the past more than the past itself. So, they say nostalgia is what? Remembering things the way they never were, right? That's what they call nostalgia. The 19th century, in many ways, remembered things the way they never were. An outgrowth of that, perhaps, is what I noted down here, is the birth of the liturgical movement. There was a notion that, the hymn, Come Holy Ghost, Creator bless. The composer of that is a man named Louis Lambilot, and S.J., he was a Jesuit. He is credited with being the founder of the liturgical movement at the end of the 18th century, really. So he's even before the big 19th century push. But there was this notion that somehow what we were doing didn't represent the pure liturgy, the pure worship of our forebears. And the liturgical movement was begun as a way to renovate and reinvigorate the liturgy. And the very first fruit of this, first really meaningful fruit of that, is the founding of the Abbey of Salem in France. Now, the founder of this abbey was a man by the name of Dom Prosper Guéranger, who was a secular priest. He was a priest for, I can't remember which diocese, but he was a secular priest, and he decided that he was going to reestablish the medieval abbey of Saint-Pierre de Salem and rebuild it stone by stone. It was it would be like me going down to the old Met on Fairmount and saying, I'm going to do operas here within 2 years. I mean, it's a crazy idea. I actually do have that idea. But in any case, this was pure romance, but he did it. He refounded the Benedictine order in France. Now, France was a major Benedictine hotspot back in the day, like Ireland before it. Actually, Ireland had a sort of the rule of Columbanus, which eventually became Benedictine later. St. Columbakill, or St. Columba, he went from Ireland and re-Christianized Central Europe and France, and he found a bunch of monasteries there. And the rule of St. Columbanus was the rule there, but they drifted into Benedictinism, and today those places are all Benedictine. But Benedictinism completely was stamped out by the French Revolution, of course. It was just obliterated. And not only that, but there was this new French Rite, the Gallican Rite. But it's not the real Gallican Rite that Charlemagne replaced with the Roman Rite. It was a kind of a degenerate, non-Latin. They were saying Mass in French in France after the Revolution. It's hard to believe. We think, oh, the vernacular didn't happen until the 20th century. In France, they were saying it, and the Roman Rite was gone. Guéranger single-handedly restarted Benedictinism in France, and the Roman Rite was refounded and reestablished. He trained countless priests to reinvigorate the liturgy. He's a real hero, and I wonder why there isn't a cause for his canonization. There may be some kind of a skeleton we don't know about. I know that he was into Lamennais, who was considered he was condemned by, I think, Gregory the 16th, right? Yes, he was condemned by Gregory the 16th, and Guéranger eventually said, I'm not a Lamennais anymore, but originally he was. In any case, this founding of Salem's Abbey seeps over into a very important renovation of the chant in the early 20th century. In the early 20th century, I have modernism encroaches there, this ominous black cloud there. It's it sounds very scary, and it is. But anyway, the thing about it is that around 1903, Pope Pius X, Pope St. Pius X, was elected in 1903 in, I can't remember which month, probably September.
Well, Leo XIII dies in July.
So July 1903, he dies. November 22nd, 1903, Pius X has written a motu proprio, which is a papal document of his own motion, of his own will, on sacred music. So this was very high in the order of, modernism is encroaching, and he's writing about music. It seems like a kind of a decadent concern, but it wasn't for Pius. He was very, very worried about it when he, even in Mantua, when he was the Bishop of Mantua, he renovated the liturgical music there, and much of what he did, he applied to the Universal Church when he became Pope. But one of the things that he was interested in was restoring the chant, the Gregorian music. He wanted to purify it, strip it from any impurities that have encrusted themselves on the chant. And so he got all the different Benedictine abbeys from all over the place to come and sing for him in Rome. And the Germans came, and they sang very lustily and vigorously the chant. And the French came, and Don Macro and the great French scholars of Salem came. And they sang this beautiful, seamless, ethereal style of chant that completely captivated St. Pius. And he said, this is it. This is going to be the chant that we will make our case with. And so he made his decision right then and there. And so Salem became this font, the Fons Culturae, where it just sort of issued forth all of this scholarship, all of these new books containing, this very book here, for example. This is the Liber Usualis. I think this is like a 1937 maybe. It's an old one. But this book comes from Salem, and it's sort of a handbook with the most important chants. If you're a priest or a monk or a chorister, this is going to get you through. This is the most important book. But the revision of all of these books was entirely entrusted by the Pope to Salem. Not just now. The interesting thing is that the care of teaching the chant, in other words, the method, was endorsed by the Pope, but not prescribed by the Pope. So he didn't say, you have to do it, you have to sing it like the Salem's monk. But he earnestly suggested it. So that was sort of an interesting little renaissance in the early 20th century for sacred music. And then we have the Second Vatican Council listed there in 20th century. And certainly this is a very controversial topic when we talk about sacred music, because I imagine most of you are here because you like sacred music, right? It would seem that. And there's, I think, a period of secularism and decadence is what I sort of write about sacred music of our own time. My opinion is that the music that dominates the church right now is at least entirely out of step with the music that came before it. That there is a great chasm between the tradition, the traditio, and what we have right now. And sort of towards the end of this succession of courses, I'd like to try to delve into that and explore first of all, what the council said, and then what happened. And you can decide for yourselves if there's a discrepancy there. Yes, Pete?
Is there typically this period of time where, from any council, there's kind of that period where the stuff is understood or misunderstood and
Oh, yeah.
accepted or not accepted, and it's sort of the time and pauses of what it was actually supposed to be?
Yeah, I'll answer this and then we'll have a little break. I think that, take St. Vincent de Paul, for example. He was complaining that more than 100 years after, that people were not following Council of Trent. The Council of Trent hadn't been put into practice. And so that certainly was a common thing where there was a struggle, thank you, to actually make things happen. Vatican I saw a great deal of controversy after it. We had the Old Catholics, which is the Dutch city, Utrecht. Yeah. Well, I know the Bishop of Little Rock, Arkansas, left the Catholic fold after Vatican I. Isn't it funny though? Little Rock and Big Rock. I always thought that was amusing. But the Bishop of Little Rock, Arkansas, became an Old Catholic, and there was a real period of turmoil after Vatican I, and there were also things like Cardinal Newman sort of clarifying his position on papal infallibility and saying, regardless of what I said, Vatican I is what I believe. So there's always this period of turmoil after a council, which is why they're so dangerous to call. And the popes take that very much into consideration when they call a council. It's not a get-together. This is very serious stuff. In the early councils, people died after council, these things were not, it's like, oh, they said that Christ has two natures, all right. It didn't work that way. It was serious bloodshed and turmoil that followed the council. And I think that we're in a period of turmoil. I think that can be said objectively, regardless of your particular tastes in music. I think that has to be something that is generally accepted. Why don't we take a little break right now? This is basically for your information. I think you need to have some basic compendium of the texts of the Mass. And so I just got that you can see that comes right off the internet. There are tons of other sites that have the text of the Mass. This is only what we would call the ordinary of the Mass. The ordinary of the Mass, the best way that I can describe, Thank you, Mr. Copa. The best way I can describe this is that we all know how to sing Happy Birthday, right? And basically, pretty much every time you sing Happy Birthday, the text is virtually the same. Except there's some changeable part, which is whoever's birthday it is, you put their name in that changeable part, and that would be, it makes every singing of Happy Birthday a unique experience, more or less, right? The same thing is true with the liturgy, in that you have the unchanging part of the liturgy, the part that's always there. That would be the ordinary. Now, ordinary is a funny word because it means those parts of the Mass that do not change, but it also means the person who has jurisdiction in a diocese, like the ordinary of the Archdiocese of Philadelphia is Cardinal Regali. The ordinary of the Diocese of Camden is Bishop Galante. But in this case, ordinary means those parts of the Mass that do not change. That is what I gave you in that thick packet there. The parts of the Mass that do change are called the proper. Can you give me just sort of an example of a text that is part of the ordinary, a musical text, if possible? Kyrie. There we go. In fact, that's the first one. And I'm going to put a list here. Of these there are basically 5 main musical parts of the ordinary. Generally, in a real solemn Mass, virtually everything is sung. Virtually. I'd say 90% of the words of 85% of the words of the Mass are sung. That's, give or take 5%. Give me another text the Gloria. We're going right in order here. This is great. The Gloria. The Sanctus. What is the second half of the Sanctus? The Benedictus. So I always call it the Sanctus Benedictus because although originally the Sanctus Benedictus was all one text, in later musical forms, composers split the Sanctus from the Benedictus, and we'll look at that particularly when we get to Bach and Haydn and Mozart. So I call it the Sanctus Benedictus. What would go in between the Gloria and the Sanctus? The Credo. You get $5 if you've sung the Credo in church the last 6 months. Agnus Dei. Well, the Anglicans call it the Agnus Dei. I went to school with a girl named Agnes Dei. They also call this the Sanctus. But in Roman pronunciation, this GN is like onion, like agnus. The G becomes a retroflex and becomes agnus. What? Language. See? We're already doing it. It's already... I hope you don't have a fear of foreign languages because, and you shouldn't. You shouldn't be afraid of it because a language is a dialect with an army. That's all it is. In other words, is that it is. It is. You had all of the in the British Isles. Well, here's a perfect example. Ireland. The Irish language sort of was. They didn't have as good an army as the English language did. So language is totally arbitrary. Don't worry about language. We're just going to focus on meaning more than anything. By the way, what language is this word? Yeah, that's Greek. See, I can't write on a blackboard. Greek, that's the only part of the Mass that's in Greek, except for one other little item that is sung on Good Friday. It's called the Trisagion, which is the Hagios Hotheos, Hagios Hathanatos, Hagios Iskaros. I got that backwards. I think it's Iskaros, then Athanatos. And then when you sing that on Good Friday, Hagios Hotheos is translated into Sanctus Deus, which is Latin, so everybody can understand it. That was the idea, right? So, but the Greek they never translated, and it's interesting that the Kyrie, according to Adrian Fortescue, a great historian of the Mass, well, you think, well, it's Greek. That must be a leftover from the days when the Roman liturgy was in Greek. It actually looks like the Kyrie was imported later, after the Mass was already in Latin. So that's sort of an interesting thing, that they didn't preserve a Greek section, but they actually imported a Greek section, a Greek text. The Gloria, as we know it, is traditionally composed by, anybody know? Besides the angels. How about the rest of it? They've got a big, the angelic salutation, well, no, the angelic salutation is the Ave Maria, but the Gloria certainly is the quote from the Christmas narrative. But St. Ambrose is in some cases credited with composing the rest of the Gloria. The Credo was composed by the church at Nicaea. Interestingly enough, this is the only text among these five that really isn't a prayer, per se. It's a profession of faith. It says what we believe, but it's not really a prayer directed to God. It's beside the point, but an important beside the point. Not everything beside the point is unimportant. The Sanctus and the Benedictus. The Sanctus, of course, this text comes from, anybody know what book of the Bible? Isaiah, right. And then the Benedictus comes from?
Psalm 18.
Yes, but also from the New Testament. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord after the baptism of the Lord. St. John the Baptist says it in, is it Luke? I can't remember which. There's a Benedictus qui venit in nomine Domini also occurs in the New Testament. Agnus Dei is.
Shall see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in.
That's right. Yes, there it is. Do you know what gospel that was in? Luke. Yeah, I think it's Luke. The Agnus Dei is a corollary of the Benedictus. Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, miserere nobis, have mercy on us. This was introduced into the Roman liturgy by a Syrian, of all things, Pope Sergius I, I think. Rome was always cosmopolitan. They called the Dark Ages. They were very bright Dark Ages. There were people coming to Rome from everywhere, becoming priests for the Diocese of Rome, from Greece, from Dalmatia, from Syria, from Egypt, from Ethiopia. And this is a very special thing because it was brought to the church from an Eastern pope, Pope Sergius, in the, I'll have to look at my timeline again, but 9th century maybe? 7th century. So these are the main texts that are going to have a musical reality. I'm going to play a little bit of one for you right now, if I can figure this out. Here it is. graceful fade, but that'll have to do. The Kyrie is an acclamation, and it is probably pre-Christian from the East, or even from the imperial retinue. I mean, this was the Kyrios, in Greek. You have my Greek is a little rusty, but let's see here. There it is. The Kyrios, accent there, I believe. We translate that as Lord, but it's really, Lord is the emperor. And so this acclamation, Kyrie eleison, is really a general acclamation. Lord, be merciful, but it's also entreat to our cause. In other words, be on our side. And it is not traditionally a penitential text. Unfortunately, the way that the Reform has worked out in the last 30 years, they've turned it into a miserere in terms of like Psalm 50 or 51 in English, have mercy on me, O God. But that's not the original intent of this. It's pre-Christian, an acclamation of the people to the emperor. And in fact, the Christe was added by Gregory, Pope St. Gregory the First. And he added the Christe, and the Eastern churches had nothing to do with Christe eleison. They just say Kyrie eleison. They never say Christe eleison. So this is a very interesting little wrinkle in the textual history of the Mass. The Gloria, we've talked about that a little bit. The Credo was introduced in the Roman Rite really not until the second millennium, which we just finished a couple years ago. Sanctus is the earliest ordinary chant of the Mass, 2nd century. And we're going to do a little singing next week of this Sanctus, Sanctus, which is probably the oldest Christian tune that we have. And the Agnus Dei, as I said, was a 7th century innovation by Pope, not an innovation, but brought from the East. He also brought a lot of Marian feast days, like the Annunciation and the Assumption and the Nativity of the BVM were all introduced by Pope Sergius, coming from the East, where they had a lot more feasts to honor the Blessed Virgin. This is the meat and potatoes of sacred music. These 5 texts represent the most important cornerstone behind the music. The text is the most important thing. And if we look at the idea of rite, R-I-T-E, I just want to talk about that for just a second. I gave you that little chart there that starts with Antioch, right? Rite. Okay, let's go back one step to Latin. The Latin word for rite is ritus, 4th declension, not 2nd. And then Greek. This is a tough one. Rite. Arithmatos. In English, we say, there's an English translation, you can see arithmetic is embedded in that, and you see the rith, R-I-T-H, that's the connection to ritus. And then before that, in Sanskrit, we have, now I don't know Sanskrit, but this is how they transliterate Sanskrit. I take their word for it. I don't really know. But here's the word. Urtam. Sanskrit, of course, is the language of ancient India, from which we get the Indo-European languages, of which English and Latin are just 2. But everything in Europe is Indo-European with the exception of Finnish, Hungarian, and Basque. And poor Basques, no one knows where their language comes from. Also, if you include Georgia as part of Europe, more or less, that is also non-Indo-European. But anyway, you've got this idea, arithmatos, reckoning. Reckon. Räkning in Swedish is the word for count, right? Reckon is to, did I spell reckon right? Maybe, maybe not. But anyway, reckon is part of this idea of what we owe to God, the reckoning. So ritus. Cultus is sort of a side word next to the cultus, the cult, is why we do the ritus, the rite. And urtam in Sanskrit means sacred usage. All right, so that's sort of the background. What do we think of when we think of rite? What is a rite? Something, order? That's a great word. Latin word is ordo, as in ordo missae, the order of the Mass, the ordo virtutum, the order of the virtues. Ordo is any kind. In fact, when I do it with my choir down the street here, when I write the ordo musicae, the order of music. It's organized. Another word, prescribed. Scribe is written, pre means before. In other words, we don't kind of wing it when we go out there. It's written down and we do what in other words, we know what's going to happen. It's not extemporaneous in any way. Can you think of any other words that might describe rite? Oh, what's that? Common, yeah. In other words, a rite that occurs, for example, you have to wonder if whether a rite that occurs in one place is really a rite. There is one example of that. But a rite is something that is shared by a group of people. The Roman rite is shared by Roman Catholics. The Armenian rite is shared by Armenians, etc. So there's a certain commonality to rite. Theoretically, I can go to, it's not a good example. I can go to Australia and attend Mass, and ritually it should be the same as in Philadelphia. That's the whole idea of it. So commonality is a very important idea. Any other thoughts about that?
Also style.
Style. That's a great word. Style. That's a very good word, particularly as we move now into that last sheet that I gave you. And it's got Antioch, Alexandria, Rome, and the Gallican Rite. Now this is where my favorite thing to go hand in hand with a timeline. What do you think need to go hand in hand with a timeline? A map. A map and a timeline, and you can do anything. I'm telling you, it's great. Let's just say, well, we'll start with Italia there. All right, and then we come over down here, the Riviera, and here's Hispania. Here's Gallia, which is France. Spain is down here. I'll put an S for Spain, F for France, I for Italia. Up here, the Netherlands. All right, more or less Scandinavia here, the Baltic. Over here, we'll put merry old England and Ireland. The Faroe Islands, I'm just kidding. And then we come down here, we have the Adriatic. Gibraltar. Not bad, right? It's more or less the orbis terrarum, the Romans called it. And you could see why the orbis, the orb, the circle, terrarum of lands. To the Romans, let's put good old Sicily in here, Sardinia, Corsica, Crete, whatever. But anyway, this little circle of lands was the universe to the Romans. Even though they extended their empire into Persia and up to England, the idea of the orb is very important. There are four main centers for liturgy, four parent rites they're called. The one that we know best, the one the world knows best, is the Roman Rite. It's by far the most widespread of the Christian rites. So there's the Roman Rite. We'll put an R there. Down here is the Alexandrian Rite. I'll just put an AX there for Alexandria. Over here in present-day Lebanon, we have the Antiochene Center. And then, what? Well, Constantinople actually is a subset of the Antiochene family. The one that we have to put in here is the Gallican, which we'll just put up here in Gaul, more or less. Gaul, that's a very important word. Gaelic, which they speak here in this country, is very much connected to this country. These people were being pushed constantly. You're surprised that they didn't end up in Iceland, but they didn't. But here they are on this little island out here. But they started out over here. And then the Franks and the Germans, they kept pushing and pushing and pushing. Even here in Brittany, you have Gaels. Certainly in England, you still have Gaels up here, and you still have some down here. And then the Celtiberos, the Spanish Gaels. They certainly don't look the same, but they're there. So then they have the Gallican Rite up here in France. So these are the four parent rites. From these, you have many little ritual children. Just taking a look here, I think there are 25 rites within the Catholic Church. 24, 25 rites. When I say within the Catholic Church, I'm talking about Catholic uniates, such as the Armenian Catholics or the Greek Catholics or the Maronites. They are ritual churches, real churches, but they're basically defined by their ritual. I'm a Latin Rite Catholic. There was a case of people being baptized in the Byzantine Rite and being confirmed in the Roman Rite. To me, that is the equivalent of, I don't know, cloning. And you're not supposed to mix rites like that. Where do you put those people? But anyway, the idea is that you're defined as a Christian by your rite. And this is, as Mr. Copa said, style. Style is sort of a good way to think about that. You have these different styles of liturgy that developed. Down here at Antioch, well, let's put big J there for Jerusalem, right? Jerusalem and Antioch are essentially the same thing. They're not very far apart, and ritually they're essentially the same thing. J for Jerusalem stands for St. James, who was the first bishop of Jerusalem. The Jacobite rite, the Jacobite liturgy, the liturgy of St. James. You all know the tune, Let all mortal flesh keep silence, da-da-dee-da-da-dee-da-dum. That's an English translation of a text drawn from the liturgy of St. James, which is the liturgy of Jerusalem and Antioch. Does anybody know who founded the See of Antioch? Peter. Yes, before on his way. That could have been it, but he made it to Rome. So we could all be speaking Chaldean or something, I guess. So anyway, Peter came here to Antioch, but the liturgy was that of Jerusalem. From that, you have all of these wonderful children. You've got the Chaldeans. Chaldean is the language of ritual in Iraq, for example. It is also the language of ritual in a place like the Malabar coast of India, where St. Thomas's tomb is. I knew an Indian priest, and he was serving St. Patrick's downtown, and he said, these people, they always ask me when I became a Catholic, and I always say 8 days after I was born. I mean, and they've been Catholics since the first century in India, and you know, we're sort of, it's funny how perspective is everything. But yes?
Explain the apostolic constitutions that are at the top.
Yeah, now the apostolic constitutions are a very, very tricky thing. The apostolic constitutions are a we're finding, in fact, there was a recent article that I read that they were more of a compendium of prayers, and they weren't really a particular rite, as it were. It's not like a book that says, then you do this, then you say this, then you say this. It's more of a general compendium of different prayers that were used. And much of the reform after the council was based on the apostolic constitutions, but it turns out that the archaeology was a little bit iffy. But the apostolic constitutions are a compendium, and they're a Greek compendium too.
And from what time?
First century AD, yeah.
Can you explain compendium now?
What's that?
Can you explain compendium?
Yeah, a compendium meaning just a kind of like a catch-all, a collection of prayers. Nothing particularly ordered or organized about it. And then you see you have the Byzantine rite is a derivative of the Antiochene, and you can see, Constantinople over there would have been influenced from this direction, from Antioch. But there's also a connection between Rome and Constantinople that we have to always keep in mind. Most of the time we were adopting things from them, but Christ eleison was ours. So, then Alexandria down here. These are wild. It's a wild group down there in Alexandria. I knew there used to be the head of communications here at the Archdiocese. He said, I have to set up a meeting. The Pope is in town. And it wasn't the Pope of Rome, but the head of the Coptic Church is also called the Pope. And there he is in Egypt. The Orthodox Copt. But they had a meeting, so. Then the Roman Rite, which we'll deal with much more in detail. And then the Gallican Rite. This is also a very interesting thing. You've got Rome more or less, I put it a little too far south, but I drew the map, so it's okay. Up there at the foothills of the Alps, you have the great city of Milan. And over here, the primatial see of Spain is Toledo. Now, Toledo, all right? And this is Milan. These two dioceses have their own rite, even to this day. It's much, even before the council, the recent council, it was still scantily done. But the Rite of Milan, named after its most important bishop, Ambrose, St. Ambrose, the Ambrosian Rite up there. Now, I think Cardinal Tedemanzi has even reduced recently to once a year. Once a year they do the Milanese Rite. It's a tragedy, I think. Carlo Borromeo fought tooth and nail. I mean, the great cardinal of the Council of Trent fought tooth and nail to not allow Rome to change the liturgy of Milan. And so, unfortunately, it has undergone a setback recently. These things come back, though. It's all right. Toledo is an even more interesting example. The Mozarabic Rite. Obviously, the Mozarabic, referring to the time. These were people trying to be Christians during the Moorish mixture on the Iberian Peninsula there. And so Toledo has its own rite called the Mozarabic Rite. These are real, by the way, that is only done in a side chapel of the Cathedral of Toledo and in a few parishes in Toledo. And I know that it's still being done. The Pope said in 1993, I think he said, a Mozarabic Mass, or Mozarabic liturgy, really. The Mass is a word, really, that is Roman. Said the Mozarabic liturgy at St. Peter's a few years ago. But it wasn't the old Mozarabic, it was a reformed Mozarabic liturgy. But still, it was, they lay out the hosts in the form of a cross on the corporal. It's a very beautiful liturgy. Part of this is to inspire you to go find out more about these beautiful forms. One place that I can recommend that if you want to see something Antiochene, perhaps that's your style this week, right down here on Haverford Avenue is St. Mark's Armenian Catholic Church. And they do the Armenian rite there. And it's beautiful. They have curtains, one sheer and one solid that they use. And it's a beautiful rite. I would really encourage you checking that one out because it's sort of rare. Byzantine, you can find that all over the place, but Armenian, that's unique. So basically, the Toledo rite and the Ambrosian rite are completely different from the Roman rite that we know. Completely different. They're not a cousin. They are from different parents, totally. I guess they are cousins, but they're certainly not siblings. But they are the remnant, the small remnant at this point of the great Gallican liturgies of northwestern Europe. So when you think about these things, I wish I could be there. I wish I could see on the eve before Charlemagne went Roman, what the liturgy was like there at Metz. It must have been quite something. So I have a great deal of interest in this, but I want to give you some perspective on where what we do fits into this orbis terrarum, the circle of lands that makes up the world as it was at this point in time. I'd like to take a moment now to give you, I want to give you a chant. We're going to run a little late because we started a little late. Is that okay? Yeah. Anaphora. That's a good question. The word anaphora, Ethiopic is also misspelled there. If you see a funny word in italics, it's supposed to be Ethiopic from Ethiopia. They're related to the Copts in Egypt. Anaphora is a Greek word for the Eucharistic prayer. Basically, the anaphora is Te egitur clementissime pater in the Roman canon. I don't know any Chaldean canons or any other canons for that matter. But that's the canon, the Eucharistic prayer, the Great Thanksgiving, as it was called. Let me give you this little piece of music because we need to take a look. I talk about the natural responses in the syllabus, the natural Gregorian responses. We know, for example, that in the Temple of Jerusalem, nobody sang long extended texts unless you were one of the professional singers that were in the employ of the temple. Not only were they professional singers, they were consecrated. There was ritual purity that they had to go through. The people sang Amen, Amen as we say in English, and well, in Pan-European we say Amen. Hosanna, Hosiana, which is a contraction of a longer Hebrew word, and Alleluia in Latin, which is Hallel, Hallelujah. Hallel is all of the praise is Hallel, and then that's a preposition of sorts, and then Yah. That is very important because Yah is Yehovah, Yahweh. Louis Bouillet has said recently, I don't know if he's alive anymore, but he says that Yahweh is a mistransliteration, that Yehovah is actually more accurate. Well, yeah, they were saying...
Pronounce the word, so
right, that's...
When the rabbis put the points in, they took the points from Adonai and stuck them in the consonants for Yahweh, and that's where we get Jehovah from.
Right. Right. But Yahweh, which became very popular from the, I don't know, from when I was a kid for sure, it looks like Yehovah is a better way to go at this point, according to Louis Bouillet. I don't know if you believe Louis Bouillet or not. But Yah is basically a fragment of the name of God, the sacred name. And so that was something that was sung by the people. But they didn't sing the psalms at the temple worship. Only the ministers of the psalm. You know, you see in the Psalter, you'll see, you know, for the leader, for the so-and-so. These psalms have a very specific purpose. The Psalm of Ascents, as you go up the mount, not just up the mount, but further into the temple. So that there was a real purpose to these things. But natural responses of Amen, Alleluia, these little fragments are the kernel of the song of the congregation. And so I've given you some of these little fragments right here, and we can sing a couple of them. Per omnia saecula saeculorum. And then everybody would respond, Amen. Good, yeah. Now let's take a look at musically what that little fragment represents. I'm not going to monkey around. We're doing 4-line, square note, everything. This is really the old stuff, as they say. So you've got this, which is the staff. That's called the staff. All right? 4-line staff is a early medieval invention. Basically, before that, you kind of had little squiggles like this, and then whoops, up there, and then go down there, and you kind of make a right turn. That was all you had. It was basically a general iffy shape of the melody. And I'll give you some examples from the books that show you how crazy these squiggles got. But eventually, you can say, well, how far up do I go? When I see that line go up, well, then they start to say, well, you go about that far. And then the next one, that's a little bit higher. So you start to get these lines. These are called neumes, by the way, N-E-U-M-S, neumes, from a Greek word meaning sign, really, sign, symbol, neumes. But these were called heightened neumes when you finally got these little indications of how far up or how far down you were going to go. So that was a huge advance. And then you got to the point where you had Guido d'Arezzo, Guido il Monaco, if you go to Arezzo now, they've got a giant statue of him. They're very proud of him. Arezzo, what else do they have, right? They've got Arezzo, yeah. They had Francesco della Miranda, Piero della Francesca. Yeah, they did have. You're right. Sorry, pardon me. Okay. But in any case, Guido developed an ingenious system where, and the Pope was very impressed by this too. This is kind of almost reminds you of Pius X in the beginning of the century. For some reason, Guido's monks only took 2 years to train. It took 10 years in all the other scholae. And, they found out that he was going, da, 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 da. So why don't we try that? We're going to say 1, 2, 3. So this is 1, this is 2, this is 3. I'll do it once. 1, 2, 3. Now you. 1, 2, 3. Now watch what I do. 3, 2, 1. 1, 2, 3, 2, 1. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. You see? This was why they learned the chant so much quicker. Everybody else was just sort of saying, it goes kind of like this. And they would do that for 10 years.
You got 20 new choir members.
Well, yeah, that's right. Yeah. But this was an amazing advance, and this was called solfeggio in Italian. Solfeggio, which came from, there's a hymn for the feast of St. John the Baptist called Ut queant laxis, and it goes like this. Utque ant laxis resonare fibris mira gestorum famuli tuorum solve polluti labis reatum sancte Ioannes. Now, I'm going to exaggerate certain things. Utque ant laxis resonare fibris mira gestorum famuli tuorum solve pollutis labis reatum sancte Ioannes. That last bit doesn't add anything, but you could see do, re, mi, fa, sol, la. So he used that hymn as a great way to teach people how far you want to go. Well, you want to go up to the beginning of that second line. Then you want to go up to the beginning of that third phrase. And so you suddenly have the sense of scale, degrees. A very important development. So if we look at our little per omnia saecula, did I put it on the right? Oh, yeah. This, what does that look like? A C. It's a C. That's all it is a C. And it's also the clef. So you've got the staff of 4 lines, and then you have the clef. The staff without the clef is useless. It's like seeing a ladder that you can't get on the first rung of. It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't help you. It doesn't get you anywhere. But this C says, do is there, do, and then underneath it is going to be Ti, La, Sol, Fa. So it goes all the way down. Basically, Guido didn't do this, but C became Do, and Fa became F, for example, and eventually these letters became very important in this development. But let's take a look at this Amen. We have a little square here, and then you have a little square here, with a little square on top of it, connected by a line. Did I get that right? Yeah. You got a dot here and a dot there. All right, what does all this mean? This is called a neum. This is called a punctum. Now, punctum is a point, right? To be punctual is to be on the dot on time, right? Punctum means a single isolated note. That's all. A neum is a symbol that means a little bit more than just a punctum. This neum, it means that you've got, this is Amen, right? I've got 2 notes that I'm going to sing to men. Amen, sol, sol, la, right? So this basically is just a very natural Gregorian response to what comes before it. Per omnia saecula saeculorum. I end on that note. So logically, just like in the temple of Jerusalem, they wanted to give the congregation cues, places where they could easily make an entree into the worship experience. Per omnia saecula saeculorum. Amen. Good. Dominus vobiscum, et cum spiritu tuo, sursum corda, habemus ad Dominum. Gratias agamus Domino Deo nostro, dignum et justum est, vere dignum et justum est ecum et salutare, nos tibi semper tubico gratias agere. That's the continuation of this seamless musical natural response. How many notes is that? You've only got, what, 4 notes? 4 notes. 5 notes if you add the top one. It's just a very simple formula that is natural. For example, when you hear this first bit there, pero, pero, the first two notes on the page, la, 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 mi, sol, sol, mi, sol, mi, sol, la, sol, mi, sol, mi. That sol, mi interval is the most natural. You go to any playground, la, 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 la. It's children really respond to the minor third, particularly descending. These intervals are so natural that they became the native parlance, the very basic building blocks of community singing, not just community singing, but community praying. If you take a look on the other side, the ferial tone, we did the solemn tone. We don't need that plain old ferial tone. But look, there's another one. Per, at the top of the next side, before the Agnus Dei. Per omnia saecula saeculorum. Amen. Pax Domini, sit semper vobiscum, et cum spiritu tuo. Now let's go back to this. So sing one on that. One. Okay, so one is going to be here, right? That's right. So sing it. 1, 2, 1. Good, yeah. Now, if we just take a look at that little bit there, this is probably just, we're going to do a little object lesson it's called the Guidonian hand, by the way. I think that's a great name, the Guidonian hand. But if we take a look there after the Pax Domini, see, this is the peace of the Lord, may it always be with thee. No, with you. It's plural. But et cum spiritu tuo, and with your spirit. That's the response. So it's going to be 1, 2, 2, 1, 1, 2, 2. Now I'm arbitrarily giving numbers to that. It could be G A A G G A A. Why not letters? And basically, the symbol didn't matter. It just became a scale. It became a relationship between the distance between two notes. So, if you look at the next one down there, we're going to see. This is the pontifical blessing, which is the only blessing in the classical liturgy that is sung. The priest didn't sing the regular blessing at the end of Mass. Sit nomen Domini benedictum. Good, sorry about the photocopy. It's almost like we're rhyming musically. A tisket, a tasket. Yeah, right. It's the same sensibility, the aesthetic impulse to match, to come into harmony. So let's keep going there. Let's start from the beginning. Sit nomini Domini benedictum. I'm not used to singing that part. Let's try it again. Sit nomini Domini benedictum. Again. Well, you guys are fast. Adjutorium nostrum in Domine Domini. Now this will separate the goats from the lambs. Here we go. Benedicat vos omnipotens Deus, Pater et Filius et Spiritus Sanctus. Amen. Good. All right. Now, to some of you who don't have any idea what's going on or what any of these little squares and squiggles mean, you do get a sense of participation if you just sort of hum slightly behind that. You can get into it. You can actually begin to get the sense of the communitas, as you had mentioned at the beginning here. So that the dynamics of all of those things we listed, psychology, repetition, just sheer rhyming musically becomes an element of our liturgical experience. So let's sing a couple things. Let's sing that whole pontifical blessing, and we'll do it. Let's do it a little bit more broadly. I was rattling it off there. Sit nomen Domini benedictum. Here's an experiment in communitas. Adiutorium nostrum in nomine Domini. I changed the pitch altogether, but you're able to respond, natural responses. That's what the basic element is here. Benedicat vos omnipotens Deus, Pater et Filius et Spiritus Sanctus. Amen. Yeah, you wouldn't. There's. I know one person, Michael Mangira. Anybody know Michael Mangira? That's how he would do it. Hopefully, he will never be a pontiff, and we'll have to sing in the stratosphere for his pontifical blessings. He would always ask me to pitch the gradual at a certain, which is the chant between the readings, the psalm, the responsorial psalm, basically. He would ask me, he said, well, where are you going to pitch that? And I'll say, oh, B flat. And I'll say, all right, fine. And it was always disappointing because it was so low. And one time I did say D flat. And he said, okay, that's better. So, but basically the whole object lesson on this page is a sense of the harmonia hominum, really. The sense that there's this medieval doctrine. Boethius was the first one to expose this, expound on this, that you had the harmony of instruments with the way instruments play together and they blend. Okay, that's really great. Then you have the harmonia, the harmonia mundi, where you have the kind of harmony that exists among people. It's inaudible. But this is a real physical manifestation of that harmonia that the Christian ethos, the Christian ethic seeks to make palpable in the liturgy. So once again, we get back to where we started. Why are we doing all of this? Is there a meaning behind this kind of a people work, which is what liturgy means? It's the work of the people. That's not to say people in the sense of the proletariat. That's not what that means. This is the people of God in all of their respective duties and ministries. Just one last thing I'm going to give you that we can try to sing. This is something you probably will know. It's very famous. Now, my tastes are sort of antiquated, as you might imagine. And in the classical Roman liturgy, only the priest sang this chant. And that dates back to Gregory the Great, who said in a letter to the bishop of Smyrna, I think, he said, oh, well, all you Greeks, you all sing the Pater Noster, the Lord's Prayer. In Rome, only the priest does it. So that's a very old tradition. Nevertheless, I think you should still be able to sing it, because lots of people sing it now. We're going to be starting back here on our soul, soul. Can you sing soul? Soul. Okay, for lack of a better number, we'll call that 1. So 1. Now let's see if we can transliterate this one. So you've got 1, then going up, the note goes up to the next line, right? So the pitch will get higher as it goes up, boop, boop, right, just like that. Very simple. Then you've got 2 of these guys, right? So you've got 1, so 1, 2, 3, 3. Good. Now let's see if we can do some sight reading. You've got 3 notes, right? Let's see if we can, I'll use the whole Guitonian hand even though we're only going to go here. Ready? So. 1, 2, 3, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 3, 4, 3. Wow. See, now that's development there. The fact that you're able to take that, you're able to go on. Nobody said 4, but you're able to take that leap and try to sing something a little higher, right? That's all it is. Let's see if we can sing through the Pater Noster. We got 1, 2, 3, 3. Okay, so then we're going to start together. Let me just put the cap on this pen. Ready? And Pater Noster, qui es in celis, Sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimite nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimitimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. I can prove to you that when that melody was written, it was not meant to be sung all the way through by everybody in the church. Look at the way that ends there. It's the only time you have la sol sol tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Why would there be two finishes? La sol sol, then la sol sol. It doesn't rhyme quite as well as when the people make the response, sed libera nos a malo. Now that's a proof in the very sort of broad sense of the word proof. But in any case, this is just the beginning. If you feel you have no idea what this is, we're going to dissect this system of notation as we go through and try to really get into what these signs and symbols mean. I'm going to begin with giving you some hand signals, a little bit more practical than the Guidonian hand, but still useful for you to get the sense of how sign, symbol, regardless of whether it's a hand sign or a splat or a fly on the photocopier, whether it's that, it just represents sound. That's all it is. So we're going to sort of dissect that a little bit and try to get from sign to sound as we go through the rest of the practicum. So thank you all very much for a rousing beginning. Yes?
Must